Sister Mariam Soulakiotis. Born around 1883 in Piraeus, Greece, Marina Soulakiotou became known as Mother Rasputin after taking on the religious name Mariam Soulakiotis. She rose to become abbess of the old calendarist Panagia Pevkovounogiatrisa monastery in Keratea, where she would orchestrate one of history's most disturbing religious scandals. Soulakiotis came from a modest family and reportedly saw religious life as a route to power rather than piety from a young age. She was described as highly ambitious and intelligent, joining a schismatic old calendarist Greek Orthodox sect in the 1920s. These traits would later enable her to manipulate vulnerable individuals seeking spiritual guidance. She lured wealthy women and tuberculosis patients with promises of spiritual healing and high-altitude cures for their ailments. The monastery's location was promoted as ideal for treating respiratory conditions. Instead of healing, victims faced imprisonment, starvation, beatings, and systematic extortion of their dowries and estates. What drove this religious figure to such extremes? Her motive was amassing wealth and absolute control over her followers, acquiring properties worth fortunes through manipulation and exploitation. She exploited religious devotion and vulnerability, particularly targeting widows, tuberculosis patients, and young novices who brought dowries and inheritances. Estimates vary widely, with sources citing 27 direct incidents and 150-plus negligent deaths from untreated illnesses, totaling over 177 victims. The true number may never be known due to the secrecy maintained at the monastery and the destruction of some records. How was this monastery of horrors finally discovered? In 1949, survivor Eugenia Margetta accused Soulakiotis of mistreatment and property theft, worth approximately $80,000 in 1940s currency, an enormous sum at the time. This accusation triggered police raids on the monastery. On December 5, 1950, authorities arrested Soulakiotis after uncovering approximately 170 bodies buried on the monastery grounds. Forensic examination revealed deaths by starvation, blunt force trauma, and untreated disease. Autopsies confirmed many victims showed signs of prolonged suffering, broken bones, and severe malnutrition. Property deeds and hidden cash were discovered throughout the monastery, confirming the financial motive. What happened during her trials? She was initially convicted in 1951 of fraud, with authorities initially hesitant to charge her with the full extent of her crimes. In 1953, she was sentenced to 10 years and 4 years to run consecutively for charges including homicide, illegal detention, and embezzlement, totaling 14 years. During interrogation, she reportedly stated, "I killed them with love, to save their souls," demonstrating a complete disconnection from the reality of her actions. She defended her behavior as divinely inspired until her death, never showing genuine remorse for the suffering she caused. Soulakiotis died on September 23, 1954, in Avarov Prison, Athens, approximately 6 months into her final sentence for the Keratea monastery crimes. Some of her followers continue to claim her innocence, viewing her as a martyr persecuted by authorities rather than acknowledging the documented evidence against her. Her case exposed how religious authority combined with isolation can enable prolonged criminal behavior without outside intervention. The monastery's remote location and the era's deference to religious figures allowed the pattern to continue for years. Another case would reveal institutional patterns rather than individual acts. Sister Marie Docherty. Born in 1941 in Scotland, Sister Marie Docherty, known as Sister Alfonso, worked at Nazareth House Homes in Aberdeen and Midlothian as part of the Sisters of Nazareth Order. Her decades-long career in childcare institutions would eventually expose a dark pattern of treatment that affected numerous vulnerable children. Docherty was raised in a strict Catholic family in Scotland and entered the Sisters of Nazareth in her late teens. Limited public details exist about her childhood, but the institutional culture she joined appeared to normalize harsh treatment as acceptable discipline rather than recognizing it as harmful. In 2000, Doherty was convicted at Aberdeen Sheriff Court of 4 cruelty charges, including force-feeding, hitting with hairbrushes, punching, and slapping children in her care. One particularly disturbing incident involved striking someone against a radiator. The charges covered actions spanning from 1965 to 1982, representing nearly 2 decades of documented mistreatment. What led to these institutional failures over such an extended period? Victims included Patricia O'Brien and Helen Cusitter, among numerous others who had been placed in care at these homes due to family difficulties or because they were orphaned. The motive appeared to be harsh discipline within an institutional culture that permitted excessive physical punishment of vulnerable children who had no advocates or protection. The Nazareth House homes operated under the Sisters of Nazareth Order, which ran multiple residential facilities for children across Scotland and England. The institutional culture during the 1960s through 1980s appeared to normalize physical discipline that would be recognized today as clearly harmful. How were these historical incidents finally addressed decades later? Survivor testimonies during Scotland's historical inquiry into institutional treatment led to her prosecution decades after the incidents occurred. Victims came forward as adults to describe what they had endured as children in these supposedly protective environments, many speaking publicly for the first time. At her 2000 trial, majority guilty verdicts were returned on the charges, but she was initially admonished, essentially receiving community service equivalent punishment rather than imprisonment. This light sentence reflected judicial considerations of her age and the historical nature of the offenses, though victims felt justice was inadequate. What recent developments have dramatically expanded the case? In 2018, Doherty finally admitted full guilt after denying responsibility for 20 years, avoiding further jail time due to her advanced age. This admission came only after sustained pressure and additional survivor testimonies. However, the investigations continued as more survivors came forward with accounts of their experiences. On December 30th, 2025, Doherty was charged alongside 4 other former Nazareth House nuns with 108 historical offenses, including physical and intimate harm at Aberdeen and Midlothian homes between 1965 and 1982. The dramatic expansion in charges reflected the breadth of alleged mistreatment across these institutions. Trial is pending at High Court Glasgow in 2026. The case has drawn significant attention as part of Scotland's broader reckoning with historical institutional treatment of children in care facilities operated by religious orders. At 84 years old, Doherty remains on bail awaiting trial. Her case represents one strand of a much larger pattern of institutional failures across multiple care homes, with survivors describing consistent experiences that suggest systematic rather than isolated problems. The ongoing proceedings continue to bring forward new testimonies from survivors who spent decades processing their experiences before feeling able to report them publicly. Many describe lasting psychological impacts that have affected their entire adult lives. While Doherty's case unfolded in Scotland, another sister faced very different allegations in Italy. Sister Anna Donnelly. In December 2024, 57-year-old Sister Anna Donnelly was arrested in Brescia, Italy, shocking the religious community with allegations of mafia collusion. As a volunteer with the Sisters of Charity of St. Joan Antida, she had run a prison ministry for over 14 years at Milan's San Vittore prison. Donnelly allegedly ferried messages between jailed 'Ndrangheta members and external operations since 2010. The 'Ndrangheta, based in Calabria, is considered one of the world's most powerful and dangerous organized crime groups involved in narcotics trafficking, extortion, and international money laundering. What was her alleged role in this criminal network? Charges include external complicity in mafia association, aiding extortion, and facilitating arms and narcotics trafficking, along with money laundering operations. Prosecutors allege she used her position providing spiritual assistance to inmates as cover for criminal communications that kept the organization operating despite key members being incarcerated. Carabinieri wiretaps and surveillance showed she carried encrypted verbal messages between jailed bosses of the Tripodi clan and their street operatives. The sophisticated surveillance operation tracked her movements and communications over an extended period, building a comprehensive case. The Tripodi clan operates primarily in the Lombardy region, managing narcotics distribution and extortion rackets. Donnelly's role allegedly helped maintain command and control structures despite leadership being imprisoned, allowing the organization to continue operations. How was this prison ministry operation discovered? On December 5, 2024, authorities conducted a major raid arresting 25 individuals connected to the 'Ndrangheta network. Donnelly was among those detained in the coordinated operation across multiple locations throughout northern Italy. She was placed under house arrest on December 9, 2024, rather than remaining in custody. This decision reflected judicial consideration of her religious status, lack of prior criminal record, and assessment that she posed minimal flight risk. What is the current status of her case? Donnelly denies all allegations, maintaining that her prison ministry was purely spiritual in nature. Her defense argues that conversations with inmates were protected religious communications rather than criminal facilitation, and that her compassionate nature was exploited. No trial date has been set as of January 2026, with the investigation still ongoing. The case remains in preliminary stages as prosecutors build their evidence and defense attorneys review the surveillance materials gathered over years. The allegations have prompted discussions about oversight of prison ministry programs and the potential for exploitation of religious access to incarcerated individuals. Church officials have expressed shock at the accusations, while noting that the legal process must be allowed to proceed. Donnelly's case represents a rare intersection of religious life and organized crime allegations, raising questions about how someone in a caregiving ministry could allegedly become involved in such activities. Another case would involve concealment of a very different nature. Sister Sefi. In 1992, 19-year-old novice Sister Abhaya was found deceased in a well at St. Pius X Convent in Kottayam, Kerala, India. What was initially ruled self-inflicted would become one of India's longest-running and most controversial investigations, spanning 28 years. Sister Sefi, a member of the Missionaries of Jesus congregation, along with Father Thomas Couture, was convicted of ending Abhaya's life after the young novice discovered them in a compromising situation in the convent kitchen during early morning hours. What occurred that night in 1992? When Abhaya came to the kitchen around 4 a.m., she witnessed Sefi and Couture together in a situation that would expose their ongoing relationship. To prevent exposure of their relationship and the scandal it would cause, Sefi struck Abhaya with an axe handle, causing severe head trauma. They then strangled her to ensure she wouldn't survive, and disposed of her body in the convent well, staging it to appear self-inflicted. The initial investigation accepted this narrative, closing the case quickly. How did the investigation finally uncover the truth? Initially, authorities accepted the scene as presented, but inconsistencies troubled some investigators and Abhaya's family. The case was transferred to the Central Bureau of Investigation, CBI, which conducted a comprehensive re-examination starting years later. The CBI employed narcoanalysis, brain electrical oscillation signature mapping, and polygraph tests on both suspects. These controversial techniques, including a virginity test conducted in 2008 to 2009, were used to build the case. Forensic examination revealed blood spatter under repainted kitchen walls and matched an axe handle to the skull fracture pattern. Sefi and Couture were arrested in November 2008 after the lengthy investigation compiled sufficient evidence to proceed with prosecution. The arrests came 16 years after the incident, with many wondering why justice had taken so long. What was the trial outcome? On December 22, 2020, both were convicted under IPC Section 302 and sentenced to life imprisonment plus Rs. 5 lakh fine each. The court found their motive was concealing their relationship and preventing scandal that would destroy their religious careers. In 2022, the Kerala High Court granted them bail pending appeal, a controversial decision that sparked significant debate about justice for the victim. Critics argued that granting bail undermined the seriousness of the conviction. Sefi currently lives in a Kerala convent under restrictions, while the legal process continues through appeals. The case highlighted how institutional protection and delayed justice can extend for decades when religious figures are involved. The lengthy investigation became a symbol of persistence in seeking truth, despite powerful opposition and institutional resistance to exposing wrongdoing within religious communities. Not all cases involve such dramatic concealment. Sister Norma Giannini. Sister Norma Giannini, a Sister of Mercy born around 1928, served as principal at St. Patrick's School in Milwaukee during the 1960s. Her position of authority gave her access to vulnerable students in her care, which she exploited over several years. Giannini engaged in harmful conduct with at least 5 boys aged 12, 13, including serious intimate contact in the convent and classroom. The pattern continued over several years during her tenure as principal, with one victim later taking his own life as an adult, unable to overcome the trauma. What enabled this pattern to continue for years? Her position as principal provided both authority and opportunity, while the era's tendency to protect institutional reputation over victim welfare prevented earlier intervention. The 1960s were a time when such allegations were often dismissed or handled internally rather than reported to authorities. The victims, as young students in a Catholic school, were in positions of powerlessness against a religious authority figure. Speaking out against a nun, especially one in leadership, was virtually unthinkable in that era and community. How did the allegations eventually emerge decades later? In 2006, complaints were filed with authorities by adult survivors who had carried the burden of these experiences for decades. The reports triggered an investigation into historical incidents at the school, part of a broader reckoning with institutional harm. Multiple victims came forward independently, with consistent accounts of Giannini's behavior, providing corroboration that strengthened the case. Their courage in reporting decades later allowed justice to proceed. Giannini was arrested and pleaded no contest in November 2007 to charges of indecent behavior with students. The no contest plea avoided a trial while accepting criminal responsibility for her actions, though it denied victims the validation of a full trial. What sentence did she receive? In February 2008, she was sentenced to 1 year in jail and 10 years probation. The relatively light sentence reflected her age, approximately 80 at sentencing, and lack of prior criminal record, though victims expressed disappointment with the outcome. She served her jail term and completed probation. Now approximately 98 years old, she lives privately in Wisconsin, likely in a nursing home or restricted convent setting. No new charges have been filed. Her case was part of a broader reckoning with historical institutional harm within religious schools, though many victims felt justice came too late and was insufficient given the lifelong impact of what they endured. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next cases would involve institutional patterns across multiple perpetrators. Carol Birds and Eileen McElhinney. Carol Birds, known as Sister Carmel Rose, and Eileen McElhinney, known as Sister Mary Eileen, were former nuns at Nazareth House Children's Homes in Scotland. Their convictions in October 2024 represented a significant moment in Scotland's ongoing reckoning with historical institutional child abuse at Nazareth House. Birds faced 13 charges, while McElhinney faced 5 charges for incidents at homes in Lasswade and Kilmarnock during the 1970s and 1980s. The charges painted a picture of deliberate harsh treatment rather than isolated incidents or acceptable historical discipline standards. What specific actions led to their convictions decades later? Birds was convicted of punching, kicking, force-feeding soap to children, and rubbing soiled bedding on those who had accidents during the night. These acts went far beyond any reasonable concept of discipline, representing deliberate cruelty and humiliation toward vulnerable children placed in their care. The force-feeding of soap was particularly cruel, causing physical distress and teaching children that their bodies could be violated as punishment. The practice of rubbing soiled bedding on children represented calculated humiliation, designed to shame and degrade them for natural childhood accidents. McElhinney was convicted of assault involving threats and forcing cold showers on children as punishment. Her acts, while fewer in number than Bird's, demonstrated similar patterns of using physical discomfort and humiliation as control methods rather than compassionate care. The victims were children who had been placed in these homes due to family difficulties, poverty, or because they were orphaned. They should have found safety, care, and nurturing. Instead, they experienced treatment that would leave lasting psychological scars, affecting their entire lives. What was the broader institutional context enabling this treatment? The Nazareth House Homes operated under the Sisters of Nazareth Order, which ran multiple residential facilities for children across Scotland and England during the mid-20th century. The institutional culture during the 1970s and 1980s appeared to normalize harsh physical discipline as an acceptable method of maintaining order and obedience. Children in these homes had limited contact with the outside world and no advocates who might question their treatment. The closed nature of the institutions meant that harmful practices could continue for years without external oversight or intervention from authorities. The convictions came through Scotland's historical inquiry into institutional treatment, which encouraged survivors to come forward with testimonies about their experiences. Many victims had never spoken about what happened until the inquiry created a structured space for their voices to be heard and believed. The inquiry revealed patterns across multiple Nazareth House facilities, suggesting these were not isolated incidents, but reflected systematic approaches to discipline that prioritized control over child welfare. How did the legal process unfold after decades of silence? The trial lasted 5 weeks at Edinburgh Sheriff Court, with prosecutors presenting testimony from multiple survivors who described consistent patterns of harsh treatment. The jury heard detailed accounts of daily life in the homes and the pervasive climate of fear that prevented children from reporting or resisting. Evidence included not just victim testimony, but also institutional records showing the nuns had authority over these children and unsupervised access to carry out the acts described. The defense argued that discipline standards were different in that era, but prosecutors successfully demonstrated the actions went beyond any reasonable historical norms. Survivor testimonies were remarkably consistent across different time periods and locations, describing similar practices and creating a compelling picture of institutional culture rather than individual aberrations. Many survivors described lifelong impacts, including difficulty trusting authority figures and lasting emotional trauma. What sentences did they receive? Birds was sentenced to 15 months in jail, reflecting the number and severity of charges against her. At her advanced age, this represented a significant punishment, though some victims felt it inadequate given the lasting harm they experienced and carried for decades. McElhinney was sentenced to a 12-month community payback order and 120 hours of unpaid work, avoiding jail time due to having fewer charges and factors in her background. The sentence included requirements for community service designed to hold her accountable. The convictions were seen as important validation for survivors who had waited decades for acknowledgement of what they endured. Many expressed relief that their experiences were finally believed and taken seriously by the legal system, even if justice came far too late to prevent the harm. The case highlighted how institutional religious settings could harbor deliberate mistreatment when unchecked by external oversight. Multiple victims testified to similar experiences, suggesting the behavior was accepted practice within the institution rather than aberrant individual actions. Birds is currently serving her sentence. McElhinney is completing her probation and community service requirements. The convictions sent a message that historical institutional treatment would face accountability even decades later. Another pair of nuns would face even more extensive charges for their time at a different facility. Sister Sarah McDermott and Sister Eileen Igo. Sister Sarah McDermott and Sister Eileen Igo, both former members of the Sisters of Nazareth, faced prosecution for their actions at Smilham Park Orphanage in Lanark, Scotland, between 1969 and 1981. Their case would become one of the most significant in Scotland's broader historical reckoning with institutional treatment. Smilham Park holds particular significance in Scottish institutional history, having housed hundreds of vulnerable children over its decades of operation. The facility's history came under intense scrutiny as part of national inquiries into historical treatment in residential care settings. Sarah McDermott, Sister Arimathea, was sentenced to 15 months in prison in 2024, and Eileen Igo, Sister Mary, was sentenced to 12 months in prison for the abuse of children at Smilham Park Orphanage. What occurred at Smilham Park during their tenure? Smilham Park Orphanage operated for decades as a residential facility for children who had lost parents, whose families could not care for them, or who had been removed from their homes. The institution was run by the Sisters of Nazareth, and children were expected to follow extremely strict rules with harsh consequences for any infractions. McDermott and Igo were accused of striking children, administering excessive punishments, and creating an atmosphere of pervasive fear within the facility. Survivors described being constantly anxious about triggering the nuns' anger, never knowing what minor action might result in physical punishment or humiliation. The children at Smilham Park had already experienced significant trauma from family separation, loss, or difficult home situations. Rather than providing healing, stability, and compassionate care, the orphanage environment added additional layers of harm through its harsh disciplinary practices and emotional coldness. Children were often isolated from siblings who were also in the home, preventing them from supporting each other. This isolation increased their vulnerability and prevented them from forming support networks that might have provided some protection. How did these historical incidents come to light decades after they occurred? Scotland's inquiry into historical institutional treatment prompted survivors to share their experiences, many speaking publicly for the first time about events from 40, 50 years earlier. The inquiry created a mechanism for these voices to be heard, investigated, and potentially lead to accountability. Multiple former residents provided consistent testimonies about the climate within Smilham Park during the 1970s, describing similar patterns of treatment and identifying specific individuals, including McDermott and Igo. The consistency across independent testimonies from people who hadn't been in contact strengthened the prosecution's case significantly. Investigators reviewed whatever institutional records remained from the orphanage's operation, though many documents had been destroyed, lost, or were never created in the first place over the decades. The case relied heavily on survivor testimony and the powerful corroboration between different accounts describing the same patterns. The investigation also uncovered information about children who had died while at Smilham Park, raising questions about whether neglect or mistreatment contributed to those deaths, though proving causation decades later proved challenging. What was the trial outcome for these historical charges? The legal proceedings took place with both nuns facing serious charges for their roles in the systematic mistreatment at Smilham Park. The trial represented official acknowledgement that what occurred constituted criminal treatment rather than acceptable historical discipline. The prosecution emphasized that even considering different historical standards for discipline in residential institutions, the actions described exceeded any reasonable bounds and caused demonstrable psychological harm that survivors carried into adulthood and throughout their lives. Survivors testified about nightmares, difficulty forming relationships, struggles with authority, and other lasting impacts directly traceable to their experiences at Smilham Park. The testimony was emotionally difficult for survivors who had to relive traumatic experiences in open court. Both McDermott and Igoe were convicted of charges related to their treatment of children at the orphanage. The convictions validated survivors who had struggled for decades to have their experiences recognized as wrongful treatment, rather than merely strict discipline or their own fault for being difficult children. The Smilham Park cases were part of a broader pattern emerging across Scottish residential institutions, suggesting deep problems rather than isolated incidents. The facility's closure in the 1980s came after years of alleged mistreatment had already affected multiple generations of children who passed through its doors. For many survivors, the convictions came too late to provide meaningful justice or prevent the harm they experienced. However, they represented important recognition that what they experienced was criminal rather than acceptable, and that their accounts deserved to be believed and taken seriously. The cases prompted broader discussions about how to support survivors of historical institutional harm and prevent similar patterns from developing in current childcare systems. Recommendations included stronger external oversight, mandatory reporting, and trauma-informed approaches to child welfare. While these Scottish cases involved institutional settings, another situation would unfold in a very different context. Sister Leticia Lopez. In 2001, Sister Leticia Lopez was convicted in Colombia of ending the life of another nun at their shared convent, revealing a deadly rivalry within the supposedly peaceful religious walls. The case shocked Colombia's religious community with its brazen nature and the violence that erupted within sacred space. Lopez shot her victim during a confrontation at their convent, turning what should have been a place of prayer and peace into a crime scene. The incident exposed tensions that had apparently been building between the two nuns over an extended period, with the conflict reaching a deadly conclusion. What led to this deadly confrontation between religious sisters? The motive appeared to involve personal rivalry and disputes within the convent, though specific details about the nature of their conflict remained limited in public records. The shooting was not a momentary loss of control, but involved Lopez obtaining and using a firearm, suggesting premeditation. The case raised serious questions about how interpersonal conflicts within religious communities are handled, and whether adequate mechanisms exist to address serious disputes before they escalate to such extremes. The convent environment should have provided support and mediation, but clearly failed in this instance. Tensions in closed religious communities can build over time when personality conflicts or disagreements over governance and daily life remain unresolved. Without proper outlets or intervention, such situations can deteriorate dangerously. How did authorities respond to this unprecedented violence? Lopez was arrested at the scene following the shooting. The evidence was straightforward given that the incident occurred within the convent with potential witnesses present. Colombian authorities proceeded with prosecution despite her religious status, treating it as a serious criminal matter. In 2001, she was convicted and sentenced to 14 years for ending the life of her fellow nun. The sentence reflected Colombian legal standards for the offense while considering circumstances of the case. The trial attracted significant media attention in Colombia as a rare case of violence within a religious community. The incident prompted discussions about psychological stress within convents and whether adequate support systems exist for those experiencing interpersonal difficulties in such closed environments. Lopez served her sentence in Colombian custody. Details about her current whereabouts or whether she remains in religious life are not readily available in public records, as the case occurred over 2 decades ago, and follow-up information has not been publicized. The case stands as a stark reminder that religious communities are not immune to the interpersonal conflicts and violence that can emerge in any human setting when disputes remain unresolved and proper intervention mechanisms fail. While Lopez's case involved interpersonal violence, the next case would reveal financial rather than physical crimes. Sister Mary Margaret Kreuper and Sister Lana Chang. For over a decade, Sister Mary Margaret Kreuper served as principal at St. James Catholic School in Torrance, California, building a reputation as an effective administrator and trusted leader. Behind this carefully maintained facade, she was orchestrating a massive embezzlement scheme that would eventually total hundreds of thousands of dollars. Between 2008 and 2018, Kreuper and Sister Lana Chang stole approximately $835,000 from the school's accounts, with Kreuper taking the lead role in the scheme while Chang participated as an accomplice. The theft continued for a full decade before discovery, demonstrating how trust in religious figures can prevent scrutiny. What drove these educators to steal from their school? Kreuper had developed a compulsive gambling addiction, making regular trips to casinos and using school funds to finance her habit. The amounts escalated as her addiction deepened, requiring ever more money to sustain her gambling activities and chase losses. The pattern is common in gambling addiction cases. Initial small amounts escalate as losses mount, and the gambler becomes desperate to recover what they've lost. Each casino trip required more stolen funds, creating a spiral that eventually consumed nearly $1 million. The stolen funds came from tuition payments, fees, and donations made by parents and supporters of St. James Catholic School. Families who sacrificed to pay tuition were unknowingly funding Kreuper's casino trips rather than their children's education, supplies, or school improvements. Many parents worked multiple jobs or made significant financial sacrifices to afford Catholic school tuition, believing their money was directly benefiting their children's education. The betrayal was particularly acute for families who had stretched their budgets to provide what they thought was a quality educational environment. How did they conceal the theft for an entire decade? Kreuper used her authority as principal to manipulate financial records, directing payments into accounts she controlled rather than school accounts. She created false documentation to explain discrepancies when questioned, using her position to deflect scrutiny. Chang's role involved helping to conceal the missing funds and participating in the deception, though to a lesser extent than Kreuper. Both sisters used their positions of trust and their religious status to maintain the scheme year after year without raising suspicions. The scheme worked because small Catholic schools often lack robust financial oversight, relying instead on trust in administrators. Multiple layers of approval and regular independent audits might have caught the theft much earlier. How was the embezzlement finally discovered? In 2018, a routine audit following Kreuper's retirement uncovered financial irregularities. The new administration noticed that account balances didn't match expectations, and tuition records showed significant discrepancies that couldn't be explained. Investigators traced missing funds and discovered the pattern of diverted payments over the previous decade. Bank records showed deposits into accounts controlled by Kreuper, with withdrawals and spending patterns consistent with casino gambling activity and ATM transactions near gambling establishments. What were the legal consequences for both nuns? Kuiper pleaded guilty to wire fraud and money laundering charges, acknowledging her decade-long theft from the school. The guilty plea came after federal charges were filed, avoiding a lengthy trial that would have further embarrassed the school and archdiocese. In February 2022, she was sentenced to 1 year and 1 day in federal prison and ordered to pay $825,338 in restitution for the embezzlement at St. James Catholic School. The relatively light sentence reflected her age, approximately 80, poor health, acceptance of responsibility, and lack of prior criminal record. Chang received probation for her lesser role, acknowledging her participation while recognizing she was not the primary organizer or beneficiary. The sentence included community service requirements designed to hold her accountable without imprisonment. Kuiper expressed remorse during sentencing, acknowledging the harm to the school community and the betrayal of trust. She explained her gambling addiction had spiraled out of control, leading to increasingly desperate attempts to cover losses that only made the problem worse. The archdiocese implemented new financial controls and oversight procedures to prevent similar schemes at other schools. Parents and donors who had contributed to the school expressed profound anger and betrayal, particularly those who had struggled financially to provide tuition while their money funded gambling trips. The case highlighted vulnerabilities in financial oversight at small religious schools, where a single administrator might have excessive control over accounts without adequate checks and balances. It also demonstrated how gambling addiction can drive otherwise law-abiding individuals to commit serious crimes that betray their most fundamental vows. Both nuns were removed from active ministry. Kuiper completed her prison sentence and now lives under restrictions. The school has worked to rebuild trust with its community while implementing safeguards against future financial misconduct. Financial crimes by religious figures were not limited to California. Sister Marie Thornton. Sister Marie Thornton, a member of the Sisters of Mercy, served at Iona College in New Rochelle, New York, where she held a position that gave her access to significant institutional funds. Her gambling addiction would lead to a massive theft scheme over many years that rivaled even the California case. Thornton embezzled approximately $850,000 from the college over a period spanning more than a decade. She used her position to divert funds while maintaining the appearance of proper financial management, exploiting trust placed in her as both an employee and a religious figure. What drove her to commit such extensive theft from an educational institution? Like other gambling-related cases, Thornton had developed a compulsive gambling problem that consumed increasingly large amounts of money. She frequented casinos and online gambling sites, using stolen college funds to support her addiction as losses mounted and she chased ever larger wins. The theft represented a profound betrayal of the trust placed in her by Iona College, the religious community, and students whose tuition and fees were being diverted. As a nun working at a Catholic institution, she occupied a position where her financial management was unlikely to be questioned or scrutinized closely. How did she conceal such a large theft for over a decade? Thornton manipulated financial records and created false documentation to explain missing funds and justify irregular transactions. Her knowledge of the college's financial systems allowed her to exploit weaknesses in oversight mechanisms that assumed religious figures would act with integrity. She directed payments into accounts she controlled, similar to other gambling-related embezzlement cases involving religious figures. The scheme continued year after year as her gambling losses mounted, and she needed ever larger amounts to continue feeding her addiction and attempting to recover losses. How was the embezzlement finally discovered? A routine financial audit uncovered discrepancies that prompted deeper investigation by college officials and external auditors. Auditors noticed that amounts didn't reconcile with expected balances and traced irregular transactions back to accounts Thornton controlled. The investigation revealed the full extent of the theft, shocking both the college administration and the Sisters of Mercy Order. The stolen amount represented a significant portion of funds meant for educational purposes, affecting the college's ability to serve students and maintain facilities. What legal consequences did she face? Thornton was convicted and sentenced to prison time for her theft from Iona College. The sentence reflected the large amount stolen, the extended period of deception, and the calculated nature of the betrayal over more than a decade. She expressed remorse for her actions during sentencing, attributing them to her gambling addiction that had spiraled beyond her control. However, the court emphasized that addiction didn't excuse the deliberate betrayal of trust and substantial harm to the institution over such an extended period. Iona College implemented stronger financial controls following the case, ensuring that no single individual would have the same level of unchecked access to funds. The case served as a cautionary tale about the need for oversight, even when dealing with trusted religious figures in positions of authority. Thornton's case joined a disturbing pattern of gambling-related embezzlements by religious figures, highlighting how addiction can drive individuals to betray their most fundamental vows and responsibilities. Another financial case would follow a remarkably similar pattern. Sister Mary Ann Rapp. Sister Mary Ann Rapp served parishes in Wisconsin, where she held bookkeeping responsibilities that gave her control over church finances. Her gambling problem would lead to theft that betrayed multiple communities she was meant to serve spiritually and administratively. Rapp stole approximately $128,000 from churches where she worked, diverting funds over several years to support her casino gambling habit. The theft affected multiple parishes that trusted her completely with their financial management and record-keeping. What was her pattern of theft across these parishes? Rapp wrote checks to herself from church accounts and created false entries in financial records to conceal the missing money. She exploited her position as bookkeeper to manipulate accounts without immediate detection, taking advantage of the trust placed in religious figures. The stolen funds came from donations, weekly collections, and other church income meant to support parish operations, charitable works, and community programs. Parishioners who contributed to their churches believing they were supporting faith and charity were unknowingly funding Rapp's gambling activities at casinos. How was her theft finally discovered? Financial discrepancies were noticed during a routine audit, triggering an investigation that revealed the pattern of theft across multiple parishes where she had worked. The consistent nature of the irregularities pointed to someone with ongoing access to accounts across different locations. Church officials were shocked to discover that a nun in a position of trust had deliberately stolen from the communities she was meant to serve. The revelation prompted reviews of financial procedures across other parishes in the diocese to prevent similar incidents. What sentence did she receive for betraying her parishes? Rapp pleaded guilty and was sentenced to jail time for her theft from the churches. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the affected parishes, though recovering the full amount would prove difficult given her limited resources. During sentencing, she acknowledged her gambling addiction and expressed remorse for betraying the trust of parishioners. She described how her casino gambling had spiraled out of control, with losses driving her to steal more in desperate attempts to recover what she'd already lost. However, victims expressed anger that their donations had been misused while church programs went underfunded and legitimate needs went unmet. Many felt betrayed not just financially, but spiritually, as someone they viewed as a moral authority had violated their trust. The case prompted the diocese to implement stricter financial controls, including regular independent audits and requirements for multiple signatures on transactions above certain thresholds. The affected parishes worked to rebuild their finances and restore trust with their communities. Rapp's case added to the disturbing pattern of gambling-related thefts by religious figures, demonstrating how addiction can corrupt even those in positions of spiritual authority. Her theft from multiple parishes showed the progressive nature of such crimes as gambling debts mounted, and previous thefts failed to provide lasting relief. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.